How can the wisest man in history make the biggest mistakes? Why did Solomon, who had everything, end his life in regret? And what if his downfall is actually a warning for you? Solomon wasn't just any king. He was the wealthiest, the most powerful, and the wisest ruler Israel had ever seen. He had gold, palaces, armies, and the admiration of nations. And yet, despite all of that, he lost it all. Not because of war, not because of rebellion, but because of his own heart. Because when wisdom isn't paired with obedience, it leads to destruction. This isn't just history, it's a lesson for us today. Because if Solomon, the man God chose, could fall, then none of us are immune. And that means you need to hear this story. Stick around because what happens next is shocking. All right, picture this. A young man, handpicked by God, steps into a throne room gleaming with gold. He's not the strongest, he's not the eldest, but he is the chosen one. His name? Solomon. Under his rule, Israel flourishes. The streets of Jerusalem are filled with traders from across the world. The Temple of Yahweh, his greatest achievement, stands as a symbol of glory. He writes words of wisdom that will last for generations. But here's the crazy part. He doesn't follow his own advice. Despite everything God gave him, Solomon starts making compromises, small ones at first, then bigger ones, until one day he finds himself so far from God that he barely recognizes the man in the mirror. How did this happen? And could it happen to you? Solomon didn't lose his kingdom overnight. There wasn't a sudden betrayal, no enemy army storming the gates. His greatest enemy was himself. At first it was just a small compromise. There is a political marriage here, a tiny shrine for his foreign wife there. Nothing major, right? But compromise is like a slow leak in a boat. It doesn't seem like a big deal until you're sinking. And here's where it hits home. How often do we do the same? We think, it's just one lie. It's just one bad decision. But before we know it, we're miles away from where we started. Solomon had wisdom, but wisdom without obedience, that's a disaster waiting to happen. So let me ask you, are you making the same mistakes? Great, same lie. Are you making the same mistakes? Let's rewind for a second. Before Solomon became the greatest king Israel had ever known, there was a power struggle. And trust me, this was no small family drama. This was a full-blown, high-stakes political battle. David, Solomon's father, was old and weak. His time as king was coming to an end, and one of his other sons, Adonijah, saw an opportunity. He threw a party, gathered his supporters, military leaders, priests, nobles, and declared himself king. Imagine this, while David was still alive, Adonijah was already celebrating his own coronation. Talk about disrespect. But here's the thing. Adonijah might have looked like a king on the outside, but he wasn't God's chosen one. Solomon was. And when you're chosen by God, it doesn't matter who's against you. The prophet Nathan and Solomon's mother Bathsheba acted fast. They went straight to David and reminded him of God's promise. David, despite being frail, took immediate action. He called his trusted priest, prophet, and royal guard and ordered them to anoint Solomon as king. And just like that, everything changed. One moment, Adonijah was celebrating his victory. The next, he heard the sound of trumpets, the voices of the people shouting, "Long live King Solomon!" And in an instant, the throne that Adonijah thought was his was gone. Now, this isn't just a cool historical story. There's a lesson here. How many times do we try to force things that were never meant for us? How often do we chase after power, recognition, or positions that were never ours to begin with? Adonijah thought he could take the throne by himself, but Solomon, he didn't have to fight for it. God had already written his destiny. Now, let's talk about Solomon himself. He wasn't the obvious choice. He wasn't the eldest. He wasn't the strongest. And yet God chose him. Why? Because God doesn't pick based on human standards. He picks based on his purpose. Think about that for a second. How often do we disqualify ourselves because we don't feel good enough? Maybe you think you're not smart enough, not strong enough, not experienced enough. But Solomon's story proves one thing: if God calls you, He equips you. But here's the catch. Just because you're chosen doesn't mean the road will be easy. Solomon had the crown, but now he had a whole kingdom to rule. He had enemies watching, waiting for him to fail. And in those early days of his reign, he had a choice to make. Would he rely on his own strength, or would he turn to God? And that brings us to one of the most defining moments of Solomon's life, a moment that would change everything. One night, God appeared to Solomon in a dream and said something incredible. "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Now pause for a second. Imagine God Himself standing in front of you, giving you a blank check. What would you ask for? Solomon could have asked for power. He could have asked for wealth. He could have asked for a long life or the destruction of his enemies. But he didn't. Instead, he asked for wisdom. And that's why Solomon is different. He understood something that most leaders never do. True success isn't about wealth, strength, or fame. It's about wisdom. It's about the ability to lead people with discernment, to judge rightly, to know the difference between right and wrong. And God was so pleased with Solomon's request that He didn't just give him wisdom, He gave him everything else too: riches, honor, a kingdom unlike any other. And this is where things start to take shape. Solomon wasn't just chosen to be a king, he was chosen to be an example, a blueprint of what happens when a leader puts God first. But as we'll see, being chosen doesn't mean you're immune to failure. Just because God blesses you doesn't mean you can't throw it all away. And Solomon, he was about to learn that the hard way. Solomon's reign wasn't just good, it was legendary. We're talking about a kingdom so powerful, so wealthy, that people from across the world came just to see it for themselves. And at the center of it all, a king whose wisdom was unmatched. Now let's talk about that wisdom for a second. Because this wasn't just book smarts, this wasn't just intelligence, this was divine wisdom, straight from God Himself. And Solomon didn't just keep it to himself. He used it to build one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. One of the first moments that put Solomon's wisdom on display was the famous case of the two mothers. You've probably heard this one before, but let's break it down. Two women came to Solomon, both claiming to be the mother of the same baby. No witnesses, no DNA tests, just two women arguing over one child. Now, most rulers would have no idea how to handle this, but Solomon, he did something nobody expected. He called for a sword and said, "Cut the baby in half, give one half to each woman." And just like that, the real mother revealed herself. She cried out, begging the king to let the other woman take the child instead of killing him. And Solomon knew that was the real mother. That single moment wasn't just about solving a dispute. It was a message. It told Israel and the world that this king was different. This king had wisdom like no other. But wisdom wasn't the only thing that made Solomon's reign special. He also had wealth, more than any other king in Israel's history. Let me paint a picture for you. Silver in Jerusalem? As common as stones. Literal gold-plated shields. A throne made of ivory and overlaid with gold, with 12 lions standing beside it. He had ships that sailed the world, bringing back treasures from distant lands. And speaking of foreign lands, let's talk about the Queen of Sheba. She had heard rumors about this king whose wisdom was beyond anything human, but she didn't believe it. So she made the journey herself, traveling over 1,500 miles with a caravan loaded with gold, spices, and precious stones. And when she finally met Solomon, she was speechless. She saw the palace, the temple, the order of his officials, the food on his table, the wisdom in his words. And she said, "The reports I heard didn't even come close to the truth." Now let's pause here for a second. What does this tell us? It tells us that when God blesses you, He does it in a way that makes people stop and take notice. Solomon didn't just have wisdom and wealth, he had influence. The kind of influence that made nations bow before him. But here's where things start to shift. Because with great blessing comes great responsibility. Solomon had everything, but having everything can be dangerous if you're not careful. See, there's a trap in success. When things are going well, when the money is flowing, when the power is increasing, it's easy to start thinking, I got this, I built this, this is because of me. And that's when pride creeps in. Solomon's golden age was breathtaking. But here's what we need to remember. Success, when not grounded in humility and obedience, is a ticking time bomb. And Solomon? He was about to find out just how dangerous it is to forget where your blessings come from. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. A small compromise here, a little adjustment there. No thunder from the heavens, no immediate punishment. Just tiny choices that seemed harmless. That's how it started for Solomon. He had it all: wisdom, wealth, influence. But something shifted. See, Solomon wasn't just a king, he was a master strategist. And back then, one of the best ways to secure peace with foreign nations was through marriage. So, Solomon started marrying princesses from different kingdoms: Moab, Ammon, Edom, Phoenicia, and Egypt. On paper, it was genius. No king would attack Israel if their daughter was married to Solomon, right? But here's the problem. God had made it very clear. Do not intermarry with them, because they will turn your hearts after their gods. 1 Kings 11:02. And Solomon? He ignored that warning. At first, maybe he thought, I'm still faithful, these marriages are just politics. But then, something small happened. One of his wives wanted a shrine for her god. So Solomon built it. No big deal, right? Just one small altar outside the city. Then another wife wanted one. Then another. Before long, Jerusalem, once the holy city of Yahweh, was filled with shrines and altars to false gods. And Solomon, the man who built the Temple of Yahweh, he started worshiping at those altars too. Now let's bring this home. This is exactly how sin works. It doesn't start with a big, obvious, catastrophic decision. It starts with just one little compromise. Maybe it's one drink too many. Maybe it's one little lie. Maybe it's thinking, I can handle this, it's not a big deal. But compromise is never satisfied with just one step. It always leads to another, and another, until one day you wake up and realize you're not the same person anymore. Solomon's downfall wasn't instant. It was slow, it was subtle, and it was self-inflicted. Here's the scary part. God didn't send a lightning bolt to stop him. He didn't shake the heavens and force Solomon to turn back. No, God let him walk down the road he chose, because that's how God works. He warns us, he gives us wisdom, but he also gives us free will. And Solomon? He used that free will to drift further and further away. But here's where it gets even heavier. Solomon wasn't just messing up his own life, he was setting the stage for an entire nation to fall. Because when leaders compromise, the people follow. And the decisions Solomon made didn't just affect him, they would affect Israel for generations. Now let's pause for a second. What does this mean for us? How many times have we justified bad decisions because it's just a small thing? How many times have we ignored warnings thinking, I've got this under control? Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived, and even he couldn't control where his compromises led him. And here's the truth. When you ignore God's voice long enough, eventually, you stop hearing it. Solomon, the man who once heard directly from God, the man who wrote about wisdom and discipline, the man who knew better than anyone else, stopped listening. He didn't just tolerate idolatry, he participated in it. And by the time he realized how far he had fallen, the damage was already done. So let me ask you, what small compromises are in your life right now? What's that one thing you know God's been telling you to let go of, but you keep holding on to? If Solomon's story teaches us anything, it's this. What seems small today can destroy you tomorrow. And just like that, it was over. The golden empire, the wisdom, the wealth. None of it could save Solomon from the consequences of his choices. For years he had been drifting, slowly turning his heart away from the God who had given him everything. And now, God had enough. God appeared to Solomon one last time. But this wasn't a blessing. It wasn't another promise of favor. It was a warning. Since you have done this and have not kept my covenant, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you. 1 Kings 11:11. Pause, let that sink in. God wasn't just talking about Solomon's future. He was talking about the future of Israel. This was bigger than one man's mistakes. Solomon had set into motion something that couldn't be undone. But here's the wild part. God, in his mercy, didn't rip the kingdom away immediately. He told Solomon, I won't do it in your lifetime, but after you're gone, your son will lose everything. And what King James said, life is almost everything, but to the lost, life is only time. And that's exactly what happened. Solomon spent his final years watching the cracks form in the empire he built. Foreign nations started rising against him. His enemies, once held back by God's favor, were now gaining power. The peace he had worked so hard to secure was fading. And in those last days, we get a glimpse of what was going through Solomon's mind. Because here's the thing, Solomon wrote 3 major books in the Bible. Proverbs when he was young and full of wisdom, Song of Solomon when he was in his prime, and then Ecclesiastes. His final words, his confession. His realization was that he had wasted so much of his life chasing the wrong things. He wrote, meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. Ecclesiastes 1:02. The man who once had it all realized, at the end of his life, that without God none of it mattered. The gold, the palaces, the power, it was all temporary, and he had spent too long living for things that would not last. Now, let's stop for a second. How many of us are doing the same thing? How many of us are chasing wealth, success, and relationships, thinking that this will finally make us happy? But Solomon, the richest, wisest man in history, is telling us, I tried it all, and I'm telling you, it doesn't last. So what's his final advice? Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Ecclesiastes 12:13. That's it. Not build a great empire, not make sure people remember your name. Just fear God, obey him, because in the end, that's all that matters. And Solomon? He learned that too late. The question is, will you? The tragedy of Solomon's story isn't just that he fell, it's that he fell knowing better. He knew the truth. He wrote the truth, and yet he still turned away. And that's the real danger. It's not ignorance. It's knowing the right path and choosing to ignore it. Solomon's final lesson is one we all need to hear. Success means nothing if you forget who gave it to you. Wisdom means nothing if you don't apply it. And life? It means nothing if you live it without God. So what about you? What are you building your life on? Because one day you're going to look back and you're either going to say, I lived for what matters, or I wasted it all. The choice is yours. Don't wait until it's too late.